Dear brothers and sisters in Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed us in so many ways. And of the ways that He has blessed us is the fact that He is so merciful and forgiving and compassionate towards us. And we know this because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has taught us His beautiful names and attributes through the Quran and the Sunnah. And so He taught us these names and attributes for a few different reasons. The first is so that we may get to know Him on a deeper level. The second is so that we may call upon Him by these names. And the third, which is what I'm going to be focusing on today, is so that we may implement these names and attributes into our everyday lives. So, of course, none of us could ever come close to Allah's infinite mercy and compassion and forgiveness. But that's exactly why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam to teach us how we can become manifestations of Allah's mercy and forgiveness and compassion on this earth. So once again, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Abdurrahman Elkhouli, and if you haven't guessed yet, today I'm going to be talking about how we can be more forgiving to the people around us. And I'm going to be doing this by, first of all, going over 3 examples from the Quran and the Seerah that will inshallah inspire us to be more forgiving to the people around us. And then, in the second khutbah, I'll be talking about some steps, 3 simple practical steps that we can take in order to actually forgive people that may have wronged us. So the first of these examples can be found in verse 178 of Surah Al-Baqarah, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He explains to us the law of murder. When it comes to murder, what is the law? And so the verse goes like this: O believers, the law of qisas is set for you in cases of murder. So what is qisas? Qisas means that if somebody is murdered, then the family of the victim has the option to send the murderer to a death penalty. That's what qisas is. But Allah continues and He says, فَمَنْ عُفِيَ لَهُ مِنْ أَخِيهِ شَيْءٍ. Whoever takes it upon themselves to forgive their brother that murdered a family member of theirs, then blood money should be decided fairly and payment should be made courteously. So not only is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala giving the family of the murdered the option to forgive the murderer, He's also telling them that you should reconcile between yourselves and the murderer. You should be courteous in deciding the blood money, and you should be fair. So I'd like to ask you guys a question. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving the family of a victim of murder the choice to forgive the murderer, then shouldn't we take it upon ourselves to choose to forgive our brothers and sisters in Islam who may have wronged us in one way or another? The second example I'd like to go over is a story from the Seerah. And it's an incident known as the slander of Aisha radiallahu anha. And during this time, the people of Medina were accusing Aisha of a sin that she did not commit. And one of the people who was spreading these slanders about Aisha was a man named Mistah. And Mistah was none other than the second cousin of Aisha herself. And Mistah was a young man. He had just made hijrah. He had just migrated to Medina. And he wasn't doing very well. So Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, who was Aisha's father, was giving him generously in money. He was helping him out with some money. But when Abu Bakr as-Siddiq found out that Mistah was spreading slanders about Aisha, he made an oath to Allah. He said, Wallahi, I will never spend a single penny of my money on Mistah. And so a few months pass, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He reveals Surah An-Nur. And in a portion of Surah An-Nur, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about this incident of the slander of Aisha. And in this portion, he clears Aisha's name. He says she is innocent. And he tells the people of Medina that what they did by slandering Aisha without fact-checking the information was wrong. They should not have done that. But at the very end of this little excerpt of Surah An-Nur, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He revealed a verse pertaining specifically to the case of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. And this is verse 22 of Surah An-Nur. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 22 of Surah An-Nur, وَلَا يَأْتَلِ أُولُو الْفَضْلِ مِنْكُمْ وَالسَّعَةِ أَنْ يُؤْتُوا أُولِي الْقُرْبَى وَالْمَسَاكِينَ وَالْمُهَاجِرِينَ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ وَلْيَعْفُوا وَلْيَصْفَحُوا أَلَا تُحِبُّونَ أَنْ يَغْفِرَ اللَّهُ لَكُمْ وَاللَّهُ غَفُورٌ رَحِيمٌ. Do not let the people of virtue and affluence among you, i.e. Abu Bakr, swear to suspend donations to their relatives, the needy, and the immigrants in the cause of Allah. Let them pardon and forgive. Do you not love to be forgiven by Allah? And Allah is all forgiving, most merciful. So again, I want you guys to imagine how hard it must have been for Abu Bakr to continue donating to Mistah after what he had done to his family. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't just ask Abu Bakr to continue giving to Mistah. He also asks him to forgive him and to turn a new leaf with him, to give him a second chance. He says, وَلْيَعْفُوا وَلْيَصْفَحُوا. You should forgive and forget. So I'd like to ask you guys a question, dear brothers and sisters. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expected Abu Bakr as-Siddiq to forgive a man who had slandered his daughter, then shouldn't we forgive our brothers and sisters in Islam for the simplest of wrongdoings they commit against us? And so the final example I'd like to give you guys before I end the first part of the khutbah is the example of Yusuf alayhi salam and his brothers. So as we all know, Yusuf alayhi salam, his brothers were extremely jealous of him. And this drove them to extremes that we can't even imagine today. They threw him in a well, which caused him to be sold into slavery, which also caused him to be put in jail for a large portion of his life. But even after that, when Yusuf alayhi salam, when he finally meets back up with his brothers, what does he tell them? He says, لا تثريب عليكم اليوم يغفر الله لكم وهو أرحم الراحمين. He says, there is no blame on you today. May Allah forgive you. He is the most merciful of the merciful. So not only does he himself forgive them, but he also asks Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive them. And he doesn't even bring up the sin they had committed against him. He doesn't even bring up the wrongdoing that they had committed against him, which had caused him to suffer so much in his life. And so, finally, I'd like to ask you guys, dear brothers and sisters, if Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam could forgive his brothers for such a crime they had committed against him, then shouldn't we be able to forgive our brothers and sisters in Islam for the simplest of wrongdoings they commit against us? And just as a final thought before I end the first khutbah, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, after years and years of persecution from the Quraysh, after being driven out of his homeland in Mecca, after having fought so many wars between himself and the Quraysh, now he has conquered Mecca. It's Fath Mecca. He has an entire army standing in front of Mecca, surrounding Mecca. And what does he say to the people of Mecca? He tells them the exact same thing that Yusuf alayhi salam told his brothers. He says, لا تثريب عليكم اليوم يغفر الله لكم وهو أرحم الراحمين. He says, there is no blame on you today. May Allah forgive you. He is the most merciful of the merciful. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. So now that we've gone over these three examples from the Quran and the Seerah that have inshallah inspired us to be more forgiving, I want to end the khutbah by going over 3 simple, practical steps we can take when we're trying to forgive our brothers and sisters. So the first step is to find the redeeming qualities in the person that you're trying to forgive, to find the good in that person. So an example of this would be with Mistah and Abu Bakr. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals that verse to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam about Abu Bakr, what does he say? He actually lists a few qualities about Mistah that'll convince Abu Bakr to forgive him. First of all, he appeals directly to Abu Bakr by saying, he is your relative. So Mistah was a relative of Abu Bakr. And we know in Islam that our relatives, the people closest to us, have the most right for our money and our spending. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also tells Abu Bakr in that verse that Mistah is a muhajir. And the muhajireen, they have some of the highest ranks in Islam. And Mistah was also a man of Badr. He had fought in the battle of Badr. And we also know that the people of Badr have one of the highest ranks in Islam. So make sure when you're trying to forgive somebody, you don't focus on the negative, but instead you focus on the positive. What are those positives that they have that'll convince you to forgive them, inshallah? Now the second step is to look at the circumstances that may have surrounded their wrongdoing towards you. So an example of this would be with Yusuf alayhi salam and his brothers. Yusuf alayhi salam, he recognized that there may have been high emotions. There was a lot of jealousy that caused them to react in this way towards him. And what does he say when he recounts the story to his father? What does he tell his father? He says, "Min ba'di an nazagha ash-shaytanu bayni wa bayna ikhwati." He says that shaitan caused this animosity between me and my brothers. He doesn't blame his brothers for what happened. He blames shaitan. So make sure when you're trying to forgive somebody, you look at those difficult situations and circumstances that may have surrounded their wrongdoing towards you. And the third and final step is to focus on the greater reward that's in it for you by forgiving that person. So again, I want to remind you guys that in Islam, we are not obligated to forgive our brothers and sisters. We are not obligated. We know in the first verse I mentioned about murder, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in that case, He made it fully permissible for the family of the victims to send the murderer to death penalty. That was permissible for them. But even in Islam, we are not obligated to forgive our brothers and sisters. But however, there is a great reward for forgiving our brothers and sisters, and there is some punishment if we do not forgive our brothers and sisters in Islam and we keep that grudge wrongly. So I want to focus on the ayah we went over about Abu Bakr. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَلْيَعْفُوا وَلْيَصْفَحُوا أَلَا تُحِبُّونَ أَنْ يَغْفِرَ اللَّهُ لَكُمْ وَاللَّهُ غَفُورٌ رَحِيمٌ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that wouldn't you want Allah to forgive you? So who are you not to forgive your brother and sister in Islam who may have wronged you in a very minor way? So that's the reward for forgiving our brothers and sisters. We get a forgiveness from Allah. But there is some punishment for holding a grudge with our brothers and sisters wrongly. On Yawm al-Qiyamah, there's a place called Qantara. And this is a place where if you had a grudge, if you had any discourse, if you had any resentment between you and your brother, then you on that day in Qantara, you will have to solve that problem before you enter Jannah. So I want to ask you guys, would you rather solve your problems then in front of Allah where there is a consequence, or would you rather solve your problem with your brother now when there's a reward in it for you? So I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make it easy for us to forgive our brothers and sisters in Islam. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to be manifestations of His mercy and His kindness and His compassion on this earth. Wa aqimis salah.